On February 7th, 1786, here in the orangery of the Palace at Schönbrunn, the famous double opera evening was given, and it's become something of a legend. At a party given by the emperor, two operas by two composers were performed on the same evening. Now, over the years, there have been endless stories about the two composers and the nature of their relationship. Yet both pieces were commissioned by the emperor, and both appeared on the same program that night. One was Salieri's Prima la Musica and the other Mozart's Schauspieldirektor. Mozart's offering was written at a time when the 30-year-old composer was turning out an amazing number of works of an equally amazing variety. Both of these operas were typical for their time, slightly irreverent in an innocuous way, neither of them very substantial. They were the sort of thing composers write for light entertainment, with the one difference that Mozart was virtually incapable, even in little cream puffs like this one, of writing insignificant music. But this was not where his heart was. At this point in time, he was determined to compose an opera at the opposite end of the dramatic scale, a piece that would take not only his work, but the whole concept of opera one giant step forward. In the course of composing this piece and getting it performed, Mozart would have to face more problems than the average composer confronts in a lifetime. It began with a chance meeting between Mozart and the court poet Lorenzo da Ponte. A few days later, they started work on a controversial play by an even more controversial French playwright, Pierre Caron de Beaumarchais, seemingly unfazed by the fact that the play was strictly banned in Austria. In those days, aristocratic circles in Vienna thought of themselves as divinely ordained to dominate society. In actual fact, however, the social fabric was an incredibly complicated proposition, with the strings of authority passing from one hand to another with incredible rapidity. Many of the high nobility were far more dominated by their councillors and servants than the other way around, despite the face everybody put on things. It gave Mozart a lot of pleasure to poke fun at Viennese society as he saw it. The bigger the balloon of pomposity, the more he enjoyed bursting it, and there was no shortage of targets. It was Mozart who chose to base the opera on the play by Beaumarchais, and then he got his librettist, Ponte, to work on it. After a lifetime surrounded by the nobility, he knew exactly how to throw darts at them. They may have been the victims of his ridicule, but we're the beneficiaries of some of his finest writing. Mozart's proposed opera would be revolutionary on every imaginable level. First of all, there was his choice of the obvious satire, which hinged on some pretty ticklish issues for any era, including both male and female adultery, war and peace, and the subject that had obsessed the composer for his entire creative life, the question of who is, in the final analysis, the master, and who the servant. Secondly, the drama involved anything but the cardboard figures we find in his previous comic operas or the idealized characters which populated his serious operas, for all the life Mozart's music breathed into them. Every character in Figaro was a three-dimensional, flesh and blood human being with contradictory passions and visceral feelings that would find vibrant expression in the music that carried the drama forward. And that music itself would be the final revolutionary element. Unlike previous operas with their recitatives and set pieces, the Marriage of Figaro would take on the structure of many of Mozart's instrumental works, moving rapidly in and out of keys and tempos from one musical mood to another, with every character's musical utterance in keeping with whatever he or she had to say dramatically. In the finales of Acts 2 and 4, Mozart completely abandoned the traditional formalities and simply wrote whatever music he needed, in dozens of different styles and combinations for over half the length of the act in both cases. On top of this, with no precedents whatsoever to fall back on, Mozart developed a compositional style complete with musical subtexts, sometimes using the music to express the characters' words, while at other times telling us what was really going on in their minds, while their words tell us something else. Understandably, Mozart and Da Ponte would be confronted with a labyrinth of real-life intrigues before they could finally ring up the curtain on May 1, 1786. Just a few weeks before the premiere of Figaro, Mozart completed the two piano concertos, K488 and K491. The concerto in C minor, K491, gives us a clear idea of how he felt during the final preparations for the premiere of his opera. His career as a virtuoso took a definite back seat to his career as a composer. As always, the composer took musical ideas from one form and explored them in another. More than any other work before or since, The Marriage of Figaro took a totally honest look at every imaginable aspect of human love and sex. Da Ponte's language is rife with sexual symbolism, and Mozart's music gives the whole idea of passion and yearning a recognizable, audible form. Clearly, some of these musical ideas come through as well in the piano concerto, especially in the glorious, gently yearning slow movement, which, like so many moments in the opera, represents an island of tranquility in a raging sea of drama and passion. Beaumarchais' play bears the subtitle La Folle Journée, the crazy day, and there were plenty of crazy days before Figaro made it to opening night. The reason for all the intrigue was that there were a number of operas waiting for performance, and all their composers wanted the first crack, and this made Mozart horribly nervous.
Mozart exploded like gunpowder and swore he'd throw the opera in the fire if it didn't get the first performance.
That was Mozart's friend, Michael Kelly, the Irish tenor who sang the roles of Don Basilio and Don Curzio in the first performance, describing the composer's mood. Well, the stakes were high. Mozart was going for broke, and he had plenty of good reasons for doing it. With imperial protection now assured, he was about to present an opera unlike anything that had ever been done before, and that meant he could look forward to plenty of trouble. But the thought of winning this theatrical battle spurred him on. This seemingly harmless little arietta in the first act gave the audience their first taste of what lay in store. To the tune of a country dance, Count Almaviva's valet, Figaro, comes out with a remarkable statement that if the Count feels like dancing, he, Figaro, will play the guitar. The image is obvious. After years of humiliation and degradation, Mozart is telling his aristocratic audience flat out that the Mozarts of this world ultimately call the shots, not their noble patrons. And how right he was. When the Vienna of this period is remembered in any context, Mozart's name is the chapter head, his noble patrons, whether they wished him well or ill, the footnotes.
L'arte scrivendo, l'arte adoprando, il papuccetto, di la scherzando, tutte le macchine rovescerò. L'arte scrivendo, l'arte adoprando, il papuccetto, di la scherzando, tutte le macchine rovescerò, tutte le macchine rovescerò, tutte le macchine rovescerò. Vuol ballare, signor Contino, se vuol ballare, signor Contino, il chitarrino le suonerò, il chitarrino le suonerò, sì, le suonerò, sì, le suonerò.
The reaction to the first Vienna production could at best be described as mixed. Many members of the audience were captivated by what they thought of as charming little tunes without actually catching on to the satirical bite behind them. This deceptively charming little tune is a classic example. Figaro's C major aria at the end of the first act, arranged here by the composer himself for wind ensemble. It seems like a sprightly little march. As a matter of fact, we still hear it today, accompanying military ceremonies such as the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace. But the words tell the audience that all the seeming pomp and pageantry of military events are just a cover-up for the horror and degradation of war. No wonder one Viennese critic commented that this opera seemed to say that certain ideas are easier to digest when sung than spoken. In the end, the court intriguers scored a Pyrrhic victory. An imperial edict prohibited repeat performances of any piece scored for more than one singer at any given time. Figaro and its revolutionary ideas had been swept under the carpet, but only for the time being. After 9 performances, the piece was discontinued. 3 years later, in August of 1789, the first reports of the French Revolution reached Vienna. By now, the opera piled up a record of 28 performances. The Marriage of Figaro had finally established itself in the repertoire. The reception Figaro received in Prague was another story. Mozart had been invited to a performance of his opera there only a few days after the world premiere in Vienna. This invitation from a renowned society of connoisseurs and aficionados was a most unusual honor. Even the members of the orchestra joined in this expression of respect and admiration for Mozart and his new work. Nevertheless, this meant a 3.5-day journey, which would cost them a pretty penny. As usual, traveling musicians could cover their expenses by giving concerts. This is what their hosts in Prague hoped to arrange for them. Two of Mozart's dearest friends and colleagues lived here in Prague, Josefa and Franz Xaver Dušek. Their family was one of the most influential ones in the city. Only a few years previously, they had purchased Villa Bertramka, which has since gained prominence as a Mozart landmark. Here, Mozart could rest up from the stresses and strains of travel and do a little composing. And it was here that he wrote the well-known little aria, Bella mia fiamma, for Josefa. The Dušeks had received word of all the intrigues surrounding the Figaro premiere in Vienna and passed it along to the music lovers of Prague. In this sense, Mozart's invitation to Prague and the overwhelming success of his Figaro in this highly active musical city can be looked upon as a pointed response to big city musical life in Vienna, where, then as now, intrigue was the order of the day, and where not talent and ability, but rather connections and chicanery were the decisive factors in almost anyone's success. He was now interested in cementing his status as an independent, internationally recognized composer. He no longer wrote piano concertos for the salons. Take the K491 concerto, which must have confounded the expectations of his audience. It's altogether less immediately agreeable, less considerate, less anxious to please than any concerto he had written before.